What started as a routine late-night interview turned into television chaos when Mel Gibson confronted Stephen Colbert over his relentless questioning about past controversies, leading to an explosive walkout that has the entertainment world buzzing. The studio lights dimmed as the familiar late-show theme music filled the Ed Sullivan Theater. The audience settled into their seats, unaware they were about to witness one of the most uncomfortable television moments in recent memory. Stephen Colbert emerged from behind his desk with his trademark grin, but there was something different in his demeanor tonight, a sharpness that regular viewers might have missed but would soon become impossible to ignore. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Academy Award winner and director Mel Gibson," Colbert announced with exaggerated enthusiasm. The applause was polite but measured as Gibson walked onto the stage, his expression cautious. He'd been through the media gauntlet before, but something about Colbert's energy felt particularly charged tonight. Gibson settled into the guest chair, adjusting his jacket as he attempted to read the room. The audience was typical late-show fare, liberal-leaning, educated, ready to laugh at Colbert's political jabs. But Gibson had agreed to this appearance to promote his latest directorial project, hoping to focus on his craft rather than relitigate past mistakes. "So, Mel," Colbert began, leaning forward with that familiar smirk, "it's been quite a journey for you in Hollywood, hasn't it? From heartthrob to Oscar winner to, well, let's just say there have been some interesting detours along the way." The audience chuckled nervously, sensing the loaded nature of the opening question. Gibson's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Stephen, I'm here to talk about my new film. It's a story about redemption, actually, something I think a lot of people can relate to." "Redemption, yes," Colbert nodded, his tone growing more pointed. "That's a theme that seems to follow you around quite a bit. Tell me, when you're directing these redemption stories, do you ever see yourself in the characters? The ones who've made terrible mistakes and are trying to claw their way back to respectability?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Gibson's publicist, sitting in the wings, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. This wasn't the agreed-upon direction for the interview. The plan had been to focus on the technical aspects of filmmaking, the star's return to directing, and the universal themes of his latest work. Instead, Colbert was diving straight into the deep end of Gibson's controversial past. "I think all good stories are about people trying to better themselves," Gibson replied carefully, his Australian accent becoming more pronounced as his stress level rose. "That's what makes cinema powerful, showing the full spectrum of human experience." "The full spectrum," Colbert repeated, his voice dripping with mock fascination. "That's interesting, because your spectrum has been quite colorful, hasn't it? I mean, we've got the anti-Semitic rants, the racist tirades, the domestic violence allegations. It's like a greatest hits album of Hollywood scandals." The audience fell silent. This was beyond the usual late-night ribbing. This was a public evisceration. Gibson's jaw clenched as he tried to maintain his composure. Years of media training had taught him to deflect, to pivot, to find a way back to safer ground. "Stephen, I've apologized for my past mistakes. I've done the work, both personally and professionally, to make amends. I thought we were here to discuss my return to filmmaking, not to rehash old tabloid headlines." But Colbert wasn't backing down. If anything, Gibson's attempt at deflection seemed to energize him. "Oh, but Mel, this is exactly what we should be talking about. I mean, here you are, back in the spotlight, making movies about redemption and second chances. Don't you think the audience deserves to know whether you've actually learned anything from those mistakes?" The way Colbert emphasized the word mistakes was like a verbal slap. Gibson's face flushed red, and for the first time since sitting down he looked genuinely angry. "What exactly are you trying to accomplish here, Stephen? Are you looking for some kind of public confession? Some kind of performance of contrition for your audience's entertainment?" "I'm trying to have an honest conversation," Colbert shot back, his liberal smugness now fully on display. Something that seems to be in short supply when it comes to you. I mean, you've had what, 15 years to reflect on your behavior? And yet, here you are, still deflecting, still trying to control the narrative. The audience was completely silent now, sensing they were witnessing something far more intense than the usual celebrity interview. Gibson leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than if he'd been shouting. "You want honesty, Stephen? Here's some honesty for you. You sit here night after night, throwing stones at people from your glass house, pretending you're some kind of moral authority. But what gives you the right to judge anyone else's journey?" Colbert's eyes lit up. This was exactly the reaction he'd been hoping for. "Well, Mel, I think not having a history of bigoted rants and violent outbursts gives me a pretty solid foundation to stand on when it comes to moral authority." The words hit Gibson like physical blows. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles went white. The careful facade he'd maintained throughout his comeback was beginning to crack, and everyone in the studio could see it happening in real time. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Gibson said, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You sit here in your ivory tower, passing judgment on people you've never met, situations you know nothing about. You're nothing but a—" He stopped himself, aware that cameras were rolling, that millions would see whatever came next. But Colbert sensed the vulnerability and pressed harder. "I'm nothing but what, Mel? Come on, don't hold back now. We're finally getting somewhere honest." Gibson's chest rose and fell rapidly as he fought to control himself. The studio audience could feel the electricity in the air, the sense that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Some began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the interview had crossed a line from entertainment into something darker. "You're nothing but a sanctimonious hypocrite," Gibson finally said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You hide behind your jokes and your smugness, but you're just another Hollywood elitist who thinks he's better than everyone else." Colbert's grin widened, feeding off the confrontation. "Oh, that's rich coming from someone who literally thinks he's God's gift to cinema. Tell me, Mel, when you were making your little vanity project about Jesus, did you see yourself as the Savior too?" The reference to the Passion of the Christ was a deliberate provocation, attacking not just Gibson's work, but his deeply held religious beliefs. Gibson's face went white with fury, and for a moment it looked like he might actually lunge across the desk. "How dare you?" Gibson whispered, his voice barely audible but filled with venom. "That film was about faith, about sacrifice, about something bigger than your shallow, cynical worldview could ever comprehend." "Faith?" Colbert laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Is that what you call it when you profit off religious imagery, while living a life that contradicts every principle you claim to believe in? That's not faith, Mel. That's exploitation." The audience gasped audibly. Even for late-night television, this felt like a step too far. Gibson's publicist was now standing in the wings, frantically gesturing to her client, but he was beyond listening to anyone's advice. "You want to talk about exploitation?" Gibson said, his voice rising for the first time. "Let's talk about how you exploit tragedy for your nightly monologue. Let's talk about how you profit off division and hatred while pretending to be some kind of moral crusader." Colbert leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the chaos he'd created. "Well, at least I'm not the one with a documented history of hate speech. At least I'm not the one who's had to spend years apologizing for being a bigot." The word bigot hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Gibson's face cycled through several emotions: rage, hurt, and something that looked almost like desperation. He was trapped in a nightmare scenario, being humiliated on national television by a host who seemed determined to destroy him completely. "You know what, Stephen?" Gibson said, his voice becoming dangerously calm. "I've made mistakes. Real mistakes that hurt real people, and I've spent years trying to make amends for them. But at least I'm trying to be better. At least I'm not sitting here tearing other people down for sport." "Oh, spare me the redemption speech," Colbert interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "You're not here because you've changed. You're here because Hollywood has short memory and you need to sell tickets. This whole humble act is just another performance." That was the final straw. Gibson stood up abruptly, the sudden movement causing several audience members to flinch. His chair scraped against the floor with a harsh screech that echoed through the stunned silence of the studio. "You know what, Stephen?" Gibson said, towering over the desk, as Colbert remained seated, still wearing that infuriating smirk. "I came here in good faith. I came here to talk about my work, to try to bridge some gaps, to show people that I've grown. But you're not interested in any of that, are you?" Colbert leaned back casually, completely unbothered by Gibson's imposing presence. "Oh, I'm very interested, Mel. I'm interested in the truth." "Something you seem allergic to." The audience was frozen, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply sit in stunned silence. Camera operators adjusted their angles, sensing they were capturing television history in the making. The show's producers in the control room were frantically debating whether to cut to commercial, but the raw drama was too compelling to interrupt. "The truth?" Gibson's voice cracked with emotion. "You want the truth? The truth is that I'm a flawed human being who made terrible mistakes when I was at my lowest point. The truth is that I've spent years in therapy, years making amends, years trying to be a better man. But that's not enough for people like you, is it?" Gibson began pacing behind the guest chair, his movements sharp and agitated. "No, for people like you, redemption is impossible. Forgiveness is weakness. You'd rather keep people in their worst moments forever because it gives you something to point at, something to feel superior about." Colbert's expression shifted slightly, the first crack in his confident facade. But rather than backing down, he doubled down on his attack. "Oh, please. This isn't about redemption, Mel. This is about accountability. You can't just say, 'I'm sorry,' and expect the world to forget that you revealed who you really are when you thought nobody was watching." "Who I really am?" Gibson stopped pacing and stared directly at Colbert, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You have no idea who I really am. You know sound bites and headlines. You know the worst moments of my life, stripped of context, packaged for your consumption." The tension in the studio was suffocating. Even the camera crew seemed afraid to move, as if any sudden motion might shatter the fragile stability of the moment. Gibson's publicist had given up trying to signal him and was now on her phone, presumably calling for damage control. "Context?" Colbert laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "What context makes anti-Semitic rants acceptable? What context justifies threatening violence against women? Please, enlighten us with the context that makes hate speech okay." Gibson's face went through a spectrum of emotions: rage, pain, desperation, and something that looked almost like defeat. For a moment it seemed like he might sit back down, might try to salvage what was left of the interview. But then Colbert opened his mouth again. "You know what I think, Mel? I think you're not sorry about what you said. I think you're sorry you got caught. I think you're sorry it hurt your career. But I don't think you're actually sorry about the beliefs behind those words." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Gibson's entire body went rigid, and when he spoke, his voice was barely controlled fury. "How dare you presume to know what's in my heart? How dare you sit there in your comfortable chair, surrounded by people who worship you, and tell me what I believe? Because your actions speak louder than your apologies," Colbert shot back, his own voice rising now. "Because here you are, 15 years later, still playing the victim, still acting like the world owes you something because you decided to stop being publicly awful." The audience began to murmur nervously. Some people were pulling out their phones, recording what they sensed was a historic meltdown. Security guards positioned around the studio tensed, unsure whether they needed to intervene. Gibson laughed bitterly. the sound devoid of any humor. The victim? You think I'm playing the victim? Stephen, I've lost friends, I've lost opportunities, I've lost the respect of people I care about. I've had to rebuild my entire life from the ground up, but I did it because I knew I had to change. What have you ever sacrificed? What have you ever lost? I've never had to sacrifice anything because I've never been a bigot, Colbert replied coldly. I've never had to lose anything because I've never hated entire groups of people based on their religion or race. No, you just hate people based on their politics, Gibson fired back. You just dehumanize anyone who doesn't think exactly like you do. You just use your platform to destroy people for sport. At least my hatred was born from pain and addiction. Yours is born from arrogance and self-righteousness. The comparison struck a nerve. Colbert's composure finally cracked, and for the first time in the interview he looked genuinely angry rather than smugly superior. Don't you dare try to flip this around. Don't you dare try to make me the bad guy here. Why not? Gibson demanded, leaning over the desk now, bringing his face closer to Colbert's. Why is your hatred more acceptable than mine? Why is your cruelty justified when mine isn't? Because you wrap yours in jokes and political commentary? The studio felt like a powder keg ready to explode. Even Colbert's normally supportive audience seemed uncomfortable with the direction the confrontation had taken. The host's usual weapons, wit, timing, superior moral positioning, all seemed inadequate against Gibson's raw, wounded fury. Because I don't target people for things they can't help, Colbert said, his voice tight with controlled anger. I go after people for their choices, their actions, their public statements. I don't attack people for their race or religion. Gibson straightened up, a cold smile spreading across his face. No, you just attack people for their mistakes. You just profit off their pain. You just build your career on the wreckage of other people's worst moments. The accusation hit Colbert like a physical blow. For the first time since the interview began, he was speechless, his mouth opening and closing without any words coming out. The studio audience sat in shocked silence, witnessing their beloved host being systematically dismantled by a man they'd come to see humiliated. "What's wrong, Stephen?" Gibson continued, his voice now calm and measured, more dangerous than when he'd been shouting. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you just realizing that maybe, just maybe, you're not the moral authority you pretend to be?" Colbert finally found his voice, but it was shaky, uncertain. That's completely different. I'm holding public figures accountable for their actions. I'm speaking truth to power. Truth to power? Gibson laughed, the sound echoing through the dead-silent studio. Stephen, you are the power. You have a network television show, millions of viewers, the ability to destroy someone's reputation with a single monologue, and you use that power to kick people when they're down, to profit off their pain, to turn human suffering into entertainment. The color drained from Colbert's face as the reality of Gibson's words sank in. Around the studio, crew members exchanged uncomfortable glances. This wasn't going according to anyone's script. The hunter had become the hunted, and everyone could see it happening in real time. At least when I said those horrible things, I was drunk, I was in pain, I was destroying myself, Gibson continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. But you? You do this sober. You do this with full knowledge of what you're doing. You destroy people for applause, for ratings, for your own ego. Colbert tried to regain control, falling back on his default setting of sarcasm. Oh, so now you're the victim again. Poor Mel Gibson being held accountable on television. But the sarcasm fell flat. Gibson had found his target and wasn't letting go. No, Stephen, I'm not the victim here. The victims are everyone you've ever ambushed on this show. Everyone you've ever humiliated for sport. Everyone whose pain you've turned into a punchline. The studio felt like it was holding its breath. Gibson moved around the desk, getting closer to Colbert, who instinctively pushed his chair back. You know what the difference is between us, Stephen? I admit what I am. I admit my failures, my cruelty, my mistakes. But you hide behind righteousness. You pretend your cruelty is justice. I'm not cruel, Colbert protested weakly, but even he didn't sound convinced. Really? Gibson's voice was deadly quiet now. Then what do you call this? What do you call dragging someone onto your show under false pretenses, promising to discuss their work, and then spending 20 minutes trying to destroy them? What do you call that, if not cruelty? The question hung in the air unanswered. Colbert looked around the studio as if seeking help, but found only uncomfortable stares from his crew and shocked faces in the audience. His empire of righteous indignation was crumbling around him. Gibson straightened his jacket and looked directly into the main camera. Ladies and gentlemen, you came here tonight expecting to see me get torn apart by your host, and maybe I deserved it. Maybe I had it coming. But what you've actually witnessed is something else entirely. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. You've seen a man so convinced of his own righteousness that he's forgotten how to show basic human decency. You've seen someone use his platform not to illuminate truth, but to inflict pain. And you've seen an audience trained to applaud cruelty as long as it's dressed up as comedy. The studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Gibson turned back to Colbert one final time. I've spent years learning to be better than my worst moments, Stephen. When are you going to start? Without waiting for an answer, Gibson walked toward the stage exit. But before he reached it, he stopped and turned back to face the camera one more time. I came here tonight to talk about redemption, about second chances, about the possibility of growth and change. Instead, I've been reminded why so many people have given up hope in our culture, in our capacity for forgiveness, in our ability to see each other as human beings rather than targets. His voice caught slightly as he continued. I'm not perfect. I may never be. But at least I'm trying. At least I'm willing to admit when I'm wrong, to face my failures, to do the hard work of becoming better. Can the same be said for everyone? In this room? The question was met with deafening silence. Gibson nodded once, as if his point had been made, and walked off the stage. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the studio until the stage door closed behind him with a definitive click. Colbert sat frozen at his desk, his face pale and drawn. The audience remained silent, unsure how to react. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of the host's obvious distress. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Colbert looked up at the camera. We'll be right back after these messages, he said weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. As the cameras stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, the full weight of what had just happened began to settle over everyone present. They had witnessed something unprecedented, a complete reversal of fortune, a moral reckoning, a moment when the tables turned so completely that victim became victor and judge became judged. The incident would be replayed endlessly on social media, dissected by commentators, and analyzed by cultural critics for months to come. But for those in the studio that night, no analysis was needed. They had seen a man stripped of his pretenses and forced to confront the reality of what he had become, and they had seen another man walk away with his dignity intact, having turned a public execution into a moment of profound moral clarity.